Hi, I'm Kevin Giles with Giles Flythe Engineers. The goal of this video today is to provide some education on capital reserves for those working in the community association industry. Our intended audience today is homeowner association community managers and those that are serving volunteering as a board of director on the board of directors for homeowner associations. Another possible audience that might benefit from this is those that are having problems falling asleep. This could be a good video for that application as well. Today I'll be going over what capital reserves are. Then I'll also be covering the how, what, and who of the reserve study process. So we'll jump right into what are capital reserves. Capital reserves are an account that a homeowner association or other nonprofit entity would have set aside funds to pay for non-annual large expenditures. These would be things that are not typically covered through an annual operating account. An association would typically have two accounts. A regular operating account that would cover routine expenses, landscaping, maintenance, those types of things. And then also an association would have a capital reserve account to cover those major non-annual capital repairs. This would be things like stormwater pond dredging, major drainage repairs, asphalt paving resurfacing, roof replacements. Those are some of the typical things that associations would pay for out of a capital reserve account. The capital reserve account is not used for annual expenses, things like landscaping, maintenance budgets, utility expenses. Your general operating budget and your operating account should be covering those items. An association will have a capital reserve account to routinely set aside funds to prepare for those expenses. Repairs are not required on an annual basis, so there needs to be a kind of a buffer of funds set aside for those major expenses. Oftentimes, the governing documents of a homeowner association will require a capital reserve account. It will state things like the board of directors may or shall set up a reserve account and fund reserves on a routine basis. Some state governments and other municipalities may require capital reserves for homeowner associations as well. The state of North Carolina does not have that requirement. The state of Virginia does have a pretty good requirement for capital reserves and doing reserve studies. So you have a capital reserve account for your association. You have this account. How much is enough? How much should be in that account? How much should you be putting into that account on a regular basis? And how do you know how much is enough? A lot of communities will just take a guess. I've had a couple clients that have my grandmother taught me to save 10%, so that's the same thing that we're going to do for this association. The ideal method for determining how much is enough in that capital reserve account is the reserve study. So we'll jump right into the reserve study process, the why, what, how, and who of the reserve study process. So why do you need a reserve study? Why should your homeowner association have a reserve study completed? The primary goal for the reserve study process is to answer the question, how much should we be saving into that capital reserve account each year? That will help us help your association prepare for those future expenses, and ideally help avoid special assessments. In an ideal world, ideal scenario, you would have equitable contributions to a reserve account over the long period of time, likely increasing with some average inflation rate, likely around 3%. Reserve study will also provide a budgeting tool that allows an association to plan for future expenses. It will show you exactly when those expenses are going to happen to help you plan for those expenses. And also, a reserve study can provide a budgeting tool for a homeowner association to choose how to invest reserve funds. It'll project out balances in reserve accounts to allow an association to determine what lengths of CDs or that type of thing as investment vehicles that might be logical to use for that. Again, some local governments, some state governments require a reserve study to be done on a certain annual cycle or 5-year cycle. And then also we've seen FHA certifications will oftentimes require a certain amount of reserves or reserve studies to be completed. So what is a reserve study? The main deliverable for a reserve study process is going to be a 40 to 50 page report. That report's going to cover a whole bunch of different things. We'll talk about kind of the main 4 areas that are going to be typically covered in the reserve study. To begin with, it is an estimate of the future capital reserve expenses that an HOA would be responsible for. Again, this would include things like roof replacements, exterior building painting and siding repairs. And the reserve study is going to include a cost for those items that's specific for your community community, so it's a measurement of how much roofing there is and how much it's going to cost to replace the roofing. And it's also going to include a timeline for when that roofing project is going to be required, when you're going to need to do those exterior painting projects or resurface the asphalt paving. It's part of the reserve study process, and within the reserve study report, the association will also get a general evaluation of the condition of those components. There will be some discussion about the condition of the drainage systems or the condition of the swimming pool and the swimming pool plaster surface, the condition of the various components that the association is responsible for. This is a general overview of the condition. It's not very specific, delved into each individual component in terms of very specific condition evaluation. This is more of a general overview of the condition of those components. The other components of the reserve study would also include financial analysis of the homeowner association's reserve fund. So this would include an estimate of those future capital repair expenses and comparing those future expenses over the association's current balance, the current amount of funds that they have in a reserve account. It's going to project out the reserve account balance for the next 20 years, and then ultimately it's also going to provide funding recommendations for how much money should be put into the reserves on a regular basis. Within the reserve study, you can also expect to receive some general maintenance guidelines, some non-annual schedule of repair items, but then also some general guidance on preventative maintenance recommendations from your provider. The reserve study report, as I mentioned, has typically 40 to 50 pages. There's a narrative section of a report that's usually the first 10 to 20 pages. That's going to go through paragraph by paragraph and describe what the association is responsible for, the condition of those components. We're also going to talk about the funding recommendations and the general process of the reserve study. The reserve study will also typically include all the data set up in typically tables or spreadsheets. I've included a couple excerpts from a reserve study to kind of show you how the information is typically presented. On this page we have the estimated future capital repairs. This is where we set up our expense estimates for your particular association. On this column on the left, capital item description, there's a brief description of each capital repair item that we're estimating the association would be responsible for. Back in the primary section of the report, there's always further elaboration on each one of these components, so you can always go back and look into what each one of these descriptions means with further detail. The next column you see is quantity. So this is the specific quantity of that component that your association is responsible for. As an example, on this spreadsheet, for the asphalt paving, the top two lines, there's 7,400 square yards of asphalt paving within this particular community. The next column you see is a unit cost. So this is where we're setting up our cost estimating for these repairs. The unit cost for the asphalt paving for resurfacing that we estimated for this community was $21 per square yard. So if you see 7,400 square yards times the $21 per square yard, that yields at $155,000 total cost per cycle. So every time you do the resurfacing project, it's going to cost approximately $155,000. Next two columns you see are estimated useful life and then estimated remaining life. So estimated useful life would be how often we anticipate the repair to be required, and then the estimated remaining life would be how many years from right now we're going to start that cycle, how many years are left on the repair cycle for that particular component. You can see this repeats for every single line item, everything that the association is responsible for, straight down through. This is where we're setting up the cost estimating portion of the reserve study. On this next page, I'll show you we have populated out those items over a 20-year cycle. So this takes that exact same list, this annual expense projection spreadsheet takes that exact same list of capital repair items and then populates those costs over the next 20 years. A lot of the clients that we work with like this page because it projects out, it provides a budget for that reserve account. Each year they can see 2020, 2021, 2023 across the top, and then you can see exactly what projects are expected for that year and what the budget is for those items. At the bottom of this page is where we adjust for an average inflation rate. We typically recommend a 3% average inflation rate. So this is the cost estimating portion of the reserve study. This is kind of shows you how we set up the costs. The next thing we're going to jump into is what the funding projections look like. We'll start on this page. This is our current funding analysis. So for this particular community, we took a look at how much funds were in the reserve account today, the day that we did the reserve study, and what they were currently budgeted to put into the reserve account. The way this information is set up on this page, you have your years, every year for the next 20 years listed out on that far left column. Then you have a starting balance where we're showing again what that starting balance was in that reserve account. The next column you see is a reserve account contribution. So this is how much they are currently budgeting to put into the reserve account. There should be one line item on your budget, your annual budget, that says reserve account transfer, reserve account contribution, something like that. This is exactly where that information comes from. We then typically break it out on an average per unit per month. So then that shows our clients what is the impact to the individual. So if you have 100 townhouses in your community, you can see exactly how much of those monthly dues are going into the reserve account. A lot of the communities like to have this information to help explain it to their residents and their homeowners within their community. The next column you see is a return on investments. We typically assume an average return on invested funds of around 1.5%. This is where that information shows up in our financial projection. So we're using this to kind of project out that balance in that reserve account over the next 20 years. The next column after that is repair expenses. This is the number that comes directly from the bottom of that previous page. So the previous page we talked about how we set up all the annual expenses. For the capital reserve account, this number comes directly from the bottom of that page, and this number includes the average inflation rate as well. After that, it's a pretty simple math problem. You have a starting balance. In this case, it's $71,000. You add $23,000 is what your budgeted contribution rate is. There's a small amount of return on invested funds for this community. It looks like it was just a little over $1,000. And then you have your repair expenses that you subtract out of that, and that develops your year-end balance. Then the year-end balance just magically becomes a starting balance for the very next year, and the whole cycle just kind of repeats itself over the term. So that far right column, that year-end balance. So in this particular scenario, this is the current funding analysis that we would provide. It's going to show you exactly what you're doing today. This community was putting in $23,000 each year. If they maintain that contribution rate of putting in $23,000, you can see out there in 2037 they are projected to run out of money. That's where that red number shows up with that dash right in front of it representing a negative number. You can see on the graph below, we are providing this graph is really just a graphical representation of that year-end balance. So it shows you what that projected year-end balance would be each year for the next 20 years. Obviously, this particular situation, this particular community, if they did not make increases to that reserve contribution, they would run out of funds out there in 2037. I believe, if I remember correctly, it was mostly asphalt paving and roofing projects that were falling around that same timeline, which is pretty common for townhome communities. Asphalt paving and roofs, and then maybe exterior painting are typically going to be the big three things that the association is going to be responsible for. So after we review this information, we then develop funding recommendations. The reserve study is going to have some funding recommendations to help give you a tool to budget for those reserve expenses and not run out of money and have enough funds in that reserve account to pay for the roofing projects and pay for the asphalt paving projects without having to do special assessments, without having to get a loan. So if you look at this next page, we have our funding alternative number one. So we typically provide 2 or possibly 3 funding recommendations within the reserve study to give the board some options for how to make contributions to the reserve account. Under this particular funding recommendation, we recommended to the association to increase the reserve contribution by $21,000 every other year. So this spreadsheet looks very similar to the previous spreadsheet, except for that reserve account contribution column is changing. So you see the first year they stayed at $23,000, which is the current contribution rate. And then that second year in 2021, again in that reserve account contribution column, we're bumping that up by $21,000 every other year. So in 2021, that number bumps up to $44,000. And then we increase by that same amount every other year. We generally like to make recommendations that are going to be spread out as much as possible to provide somewhat of a equitable funding as much as possible over the 20-year term. You can see the good news on this funding recommendation in that year-end balance column. Not only does it stay in the positive, it doesn't drop below 0. So the projected balance, if you make these contributions, is going to stay in the positive. But we also have that red dotted line down there is what we call a threshold balance. We typically recommend when doing projections for funding that we stay above a threshold balance to give the association a little bit of a cushion in that reserve account in the event that some projects need to happen a year or two sooner than anticipated, or if we have a spike in an inflation rate beyond the assumed 3%. That threshold balance will give a little bit of a cushion in that reserve account. How much should the threshold balance be? We typically recommend an average year of capital repair expenditures. Again, that threshold balance typically we would recommend it be an average year of those capital repair expenditures. So we take the total amount over the term, over the 20 years of the study, we divide it by 20, and then that gives us an average year balance. For this community, I think it was right around $100,000 was what the threshold balance that we recommended was. So this funding recommendation is doing two things. It's staying above zero, and it's also staying above that threshold, recommended threshold balance. And again, we're trying to, with the funding goal being, we're going to spread out increases as much as possible over the 20-year term. So this is how you can expect data to generally be presented in your reserve study. This is what it's generally going to look like, the data portion of it. Again, there's 10 to 20 pages worth of narrative format in a reserve study that's going to be explaining all of this as well. So next we'll go through the general process for how a reserve study is completed. There's basically 5 primary steps to how we do a reserve study. We start out with the reserve study process after the proposal's been approved. We're going to do a little bit of research on the community. We're going to review your governing documents to help us determine what the association is responsible for and what it is not responsible for. We're going to do some kind of research on historical information on the community. We're going to use county tax records to determine age of building, age of infrastructure. We may also look at historical aerials. We'll also likely be reviewing plat maps and just other information that is available about the community with regard to who's responsible for it, how old is the infrastructure. And we also typically ask for information on any recent or planned capital repair projects. So if the association has information on previous projects where they have replaced roofs in the past 2 years or done some other major projects, we typically ask for information on that. And that would usually include actual bids from contractors that we can look at. And then also if the association's planning on doing a big project in the next year, we want to be reviewing that information as well. After we've done our research on the community, we then do the site inspection. We typically invite any interested board members and the community manager to join us for the site inspection. You don't necessarily have to be there, but we do prefer it. It is nice to have the board members and the community manager on site with us during the inspection. During the site inspection, we're really focusing on 2 things. The first thing is to get measurements of the amount of the particular components. We're going to get an inventory of all the components that the association is responsible for. The second thing we're doing is looking at the condition of those components. That's what helps us develop our remaining life estimates. So we've worked with a ton of communities of various ages. We get to see shingles that were installed 2 years ago and then asphalt shingles that are 20 years old. We get to see what the differences are with all the communities we work with. So part of that site inspection is to look at the condition of those components to help us make decisions on when to start the repair cycles. After the site inspection, we then develop our financial analysis. That's basically the previous spreadsheets I showed you in the previous 3 slides. Setting up those expense estimates, setting up the funding recommendations, and then we draft the full report, kind of detailing out all of our recommendations along with our evaluation on the condition of those components, and then discussing what the financial recommendations are and then what the general process of the reserve study is as well. Once we draft the report, it's typically submitted in PDF format through email. Again, it's a 40 to 50 page report. At that point, we typically review the report with the board of directors, answer any questions they have, go over our funding recommendations. After that review meeting, we would then make adjustments as needed and issue a finalized report. For us, this process is typically 4 to 8 weeks in length. Sometimes a little bit quicker if needed, but typically 4 to 8 weeks total from the date that the proposal is approved to when we have that draft report sent to the board. So after that, kind of the last thing I want to go over is who should be doing a reserve study. Who should you hire to do a reserve study? What you should be looking for in your reserve study provider. The first thing you want to know is that this provider is familiar with buildings and site improvements. Somebody with some sort of engineering or architectural or possibly construction background that is familiar with buildings and site improvements, roofing, exterior siding, asphalt paving, stormwater system, somebody that's familiar with that. You also want to look for somebody that has experience in cost estimating. The cost estimates are a very big part of the reserve study process. Community Associations Institute, CAI, does provide a reserve specialist designation. It's an RS designation provided by CAI. It basically requires a certain amount of experience and education along with some references, and to get the RS designation you also have to provide a sample work product to CAI, and they review your work product to make sure that it meets the standards that the Community Associations Institute has set forth for reserve studies. There are some do-it-yourself options out there. If you were to Google reserve study DIY, there would be some software options that are out there and available. Generally, they're only going to provide the software to set this reserve study up. They're not generally going to be providing information in terms of cost estimates for your particular region or life cycle estimates or that type of thing, but it's certainly an option that you could consider if it was appropriate for your community. So again, you're looking for somebody that's familiar with the construction process. This is typically architects and engineers, and that reserve specialist designation set forth by Community Associations Institute. That pretty much wraps up the presentation today. I have my contact information on this slide. I believe it's also available on our website. We have office here in Raleigh and in Charlotte, North Carolina as well, and we'll be opening an office in Norfolk, Virginia later in 2020. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to this video. I appreciate your time today, and don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions. Thanks.